Hey, this is John Lee Dumas of Entrepreneur on Fire, and when I'm not interviewing inspiring entrepreneurs, I'm listening to Stephanie O'Brien on the Moved by Purpose podcast.
A lot of entrepreneurs, they can see that vision so clearly, they can taste it. But when they go to describe it, they get into the mundane or they get into the day-by-day operations or whatever it is they're thinking about, and they forget to paint this lovely picture of the beautiful vision they have. And if the investor doesn't see the vision, they're going to think the guy's nuts, or they're certainly not going to put their money into it.
Are you longing to know what your purpose is? Are you on the wrong career path? Do you feel like there must be more to life? Don't worry, there's hope. It's time to be moved by purpose. Now your host, Stephanie O'Brien.
Welcome to the show, Lloyd. It is an honor to have you on the show today.
Thank you, Stephanie. It's good to be with you.
So in your book, Invent, Reinvent, Thrive, some of the advice gleaned from the entrepreneurs that you featured in the book centers around naysayers. And you say don't ignore naysayers, take advantage of them. So how do you know when to listen to the naysayers and when to ignore and how to take advantage?
Well, let me start by explaining the don't ignore. It's like anything else in life. Ignore is the root word for the word ignorant, and nobody wants to be ignorant about what they're going to invest part of their life in. So you have to do something more than ignore it. I find it pretty ironic, actually, that when you ask famous, successful entrepreneurs or even the teachers of entrepreneurship or coaches and consultants in entrepreneurship what the people should do about naysayers, they all say ignore. The truth is, when you delve into it with the real successful entrepreneurs, as I did, you find out that they did not ignore it. They did something else. And the something else is they made themselves at least, and usually smarter, at least as smart, and usually smarter than the people who were already in the industry or who worked in the industry or whatever. So how do you do that? And the first thing you have to do is you have to take what they say very literally at times and go out and do your homework. I tell my students in class that they've probably spent 25 years of their lives hating homework, hating the concept of homework, when the truth is they haven't even started to do homework yet. All they've really done is learn how to do homework. Homework starts when you have to go out in the real world and nobody gives you the assignment, nobody tells you what to do, when to do it, what not to do. That's homework. We also call it due diligence, and that's D-U-E diligence, not just D-O diligence. And due diligence was best exemplified, I think, by Tom Stemberg. Tom was one of the people I interviewed for Invent, Reinvent, Thrive. Tom is the founder of the famous company Staples, which isn't just a successful company in the stationery business or office supplies business. It's what really changed the industry. When Tom came upon the scene, stationers were these local little stores that carried almost every kind of thing you can imagine usable in an office, but they probably only had one or two of each thing. So if you were the third guy coming in to buy that particular item, you might be out of luck, and then you'd have to wait. So it was inefficient. It was not very successful in the profit sense of the word. I mean, it did provide a service, and it was very comfortable and convenient, but it wasn't very profitable, and all kinds of people had tried different ways to cut the costs in the system and otherwise try to improve profitability. Tom experienced it from a different perspective. First of all, as a consumer. I mean, he did work at home and needed some supplies and couldn't get them at his local stationer. And second, Tom was not in the stationery business, which will lead to another lesson later on, but Tom was in the food business. He worked for Jewel Tea Company, which is the large grocery chain that operates out of Chicago and other places, and he had an understanding of retail and how retail could be useful and efficient without it being disruptive in the normal sense of daily life, but he wasn't sure his idea was right. So first of all, he had naysayers who liked Tom. These were the people who said things like, Tom, we like you, but you're going to go crazy trying to fix an industry where so many people have tried in the past and have been unsuccessful. So that's one of the first things you hear from naysayers. Tom, incidentally, is wonderful in that he says he's now a venture capitalist. He has never met an entrepreneur who didn't have naysayers. So they're always out there. And some of them, like those I just mentioned, are friends. They're trying to help. Some were not friends. They were maybe enemies. These were the people in the industry who pretty much understood what Tom was suggesting and didn't really want it to exist because it would compete all too well with their existing businesses. So he went to United Stationers, a company headquartered in the suburbs of Chicago, and spoke with Mr. Wolf, who ran that company. And Mr. Wolf told him, you know, you really shouldn't be doing this because it's been tried before, other things have been tried. This is a pretty well-entrenched old industry, and you're not going to make a success of it. Tom thought that there was something wrong in the way he answered the questions, Mr. Wolf, because when he'd ask him specifics, and Tom had been doing his homework, so the specifics were good questions, when he asked those specific questions, Wolf was evasive. And Howard Wolf was a good salesman, so he was in a sense trying to sell Tom out of the idea. Tom decided then he had learned enough about the industry side, he wanted to go to the other side, and that namely is the consumer side. So he called up a friend of his in New York, a lawyer with a law firm that bought lots of stationery and office supplies, and sat down with him and said, so how much do you think you buy? And he gave him a number, and that didn't sound right to Tom, who by this time was getting pretty familiar with the usage of supplies. And he asked if they'd bring in their office manager. This was in the days before everything was computerized at law firms, and asked her how much. And she came out pretty close to what the lawyer had guessed. And he asked if they would do him a personal favor and check carefully. So they went back and checked their records and came back, and it was many multiples of what they had guessed. They were spending almost 10 times what they had guessed they were spending. They had no clue. And in the law business, there aren't a lot of expenses. It's not like you're manufacturing widgets or something. So other than people, your next biggest expense may well be the supplies that you use. And they had no idea what they were spending. He then took that larger number of what they were actually spending and said, let me ask you a question. It's very convenient. The store is half a block away from here. But if I told you you had to go a mile away from here, but I'd save you 50% of that money that you're spending on supplies now, what would your answer be? And they both said immediately, absolutely, we drive the mile to save that kind of money. In fact, the lawyer himself jokingly said that would pay for all the cars for my wife, myself, and my kids. Cars were cheaper then, too. The irony is that here were the customers. Everyone says be customer-centric. Know what your customers want and need. Well, usually that means ask your customers, and that's why they have focus groups and things like that. Ask your customers and find out what they need and then provide that service or that product. Well, here the customers didn't even have a clue because they, too, had been entrenched in an old industry, invented God knows how many decades or a century before, and everybody was kind of used to the way it was always done, which is another one of those phrases that naysayers always use. It's always been done that way. We can't change it. But Tom figured out that they didn't even know what their needs were, what their expenses were, what their savings could be if they were given an alternative, and that's when he was sure he was going to go ahead with the alternative. Now, there's a third set of naysayers, other than the friends, enemies, and those are the potential investors. So I've taken things to investors on behalf of or with entrepreneurs, and the naysayers were unbelievable. Everybody has an expert in whatever field you know. So whatever field you're coming in with, they kind of bring their expert to the meeting, which is fine. That's part of their due diligence. But the experts are entrenched in the industry. So they're pretty much going to say no. And that's what happened with Tom when he started going out to investors. And the one investor who finally said yes ordinarily comes as a surprise. It's been publicly stated, and that was Mitt Romney. In his Bain Capital Company, he became the principal investor at first in Staples. In the book, I explain in much more detail why Mitt was peculiarly suited, in Tom's opinion, to become that investor. But the essence is that you're not ignoring the naysayers. You're doing your homework. You're learning the industry. You're finding out what everyone else knows and what they don't know. You're finding out why they're right or wrong, and you're taking into account that they are the industry. So you really have to second think whatever it is they're telling you, because even if they're trying to be totally honest, they're entrenched in that industry, and it's difficult for them to see out of the industry, or as they say, out of the box. And I guess the absolute irony is that what Tom did was invent the big box store, so that's even better than just out of the box.
Yeah, and I think that's a great example, and I was kind of smiling because I'm going through this experience myself, like asking the consumer what they want, and it's just so interesting. They really don't know what they want, but that's all the advice they tell you with the focus groups and get the feedback and stuff. But there's that saying where Henry Ford would say if he asked people what they wanted back then, they would have said a faster horse, but then he came up with the automobile, or he was one of the inventors. So
yeah, but even Henry Ford, if you think about it, wasn't very customer-centric, because another one of his great sayings, I don't particularly care for Henry Ford, but one of his great sayings was, the customer can have any color they want as long as it's black.
Mm-hmm.
Not exactly customer-centric. So he's very different in orientation. He had a monopoly. In the United States, he was it. And if you wanted a car, you were going to buy a Ford. And so that's a different attitude than what I'm getting at. And you also have to be careful, because it's not always the customer or the investor or whoever that has the wrong way of thinking. You know, you're an interviewer. I interview for my books. How you present it and ask the question can often lead to the answer you're going to get. So I'll give you an example. Maybe one of the best salesmen I've ever met, and I've known him now for, 20-some years, is Howard Schultz from Starbucks. Really a great salesman. He articulates well. He sticks to principles. I jokingly say in the book, I'm not talking about the super salesman type that can sell ice cubes to Eskimos, although Howard did sell frozen drinks to Eskimos. It's a very special kind of salesmanship. So I was shocked when I first realized that hundreds and hundreds of people rejected Howard when he came to them for investment. In fact, even after Howard had brought in an expert in the field into the company, his company, which had not yet merged into Starbucks, so it wasn't called that then. But after he brought an expert on, which he really thought would make a difference, people would know that this expert had invested in him, and that would give that credibility that would bring in other investors. Hundreds more turned him down. So you have to wonder. I mean, here's a guy with what turned out to be one of the great ideas of the century, a guy who's articulate and a great salesman and a personable guy, likable, because there are studies done that sometimes people invest in companies because they like the guy and think the guy can carry it off. And incidentally, I have two daughters who know that when I use the word guy, it's not gender specific. And yet he couldn't raise the money. So first I asked Howard, and I've done this over the years and gotten somewhat different answers, but pretty close. I said, why do you think you weren't able to raise the money? I mean, you're pretty good at what you do. And his answer was kind of a joke, I think, but not all joke. He said, Lloyd, I don't know why they wouldn't invest. After all, look what I was introducing. I was introducing a very strong drink that nobody had had in the United States. I was putting it in a paper cup instead of the ceramic cups that they were used to. And I was charging a lot more than anyone else. So why do you think they wouldn't invest? And joking or not, that's pretty much what he was doing, because what he was trying to sell people on was a coffee house, a place where people came to buy, drink, whatever, coffee. That was not the business he was going into. He was going into a business that was totally different than selling coffee. Yes, there were sales of coffee, but that wasn't the primary business. And I gave him 2 attempts on this. The first attempt about 20 years ago, when I said I had walked into a Starbucks. One of the first Starbucks outside of the city of Seattle happened to be in the town where I lived. And I heard some man order a doppio, and I had no idea what a doppio was. And so I went up to the counter and said, what's a doppio? And the guy explained it's a double espresso. And I immediately called up Howard and said, I figured it out. What you've done is start a club. It's like the club I belonged to when I was a 10-year-old boy, and we had secret code words that we exchanged with each other. You've created a club where vente and doppio and frappuccino and all those words were the code words that made you a member. And A, it was a club, unlike Groucho Marx, where you would want to belong even if they'd have you as a member. And B, you didn't have to pay dues, although you might say you pay it with every cup. And he emphatically resisted that. Later, I figured out that the reason he resisted that was that it was too elitist for Howard. Didn't want this to be a place where only the socially elite or the financially elite or whatever would go. He wanted everyone to go there, which they do. And so he fought me on that. Later I came back and I said, Howard, it's like the TV show Cheers, the song they play at the beginning of the show, a place where everybody knows your name. And it was the same thing in Starbucks. You know, the baristas knew the frequent customers, and if you came there every day, they not only would call you by name, they would probably know what you were going to order with both the coffee and the croissant or whatever you ordered with it. So he rejected that too. Then, years later, and I'm talking about last year actually, he finally said to me, you know, it's not a club, and it's not Cheers. I called it the non-alcoholic Cheers, which is ironic because now they're selling wine in some of the stores. But he said it's neither of those. It's a place where people can stop between work and home. I said, Howard, I'm not going to get into a semantic argument. To me, that's a club. It's fine. I don't really care what you call it. So a place between work and home or home and work is fine. But now we've got another quandary on our hands. If that's what it is, if it's this place between work and home, why didn't you say that to the people back in the early 90s when you were putting this company together? And he said, I don't know. I said, well, I'll tell you what you did. You did something that a lot of entrepreneurs do. You tried giving investors a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle, but you didn't give them the cover with the picture on it. How did you expect them to do the puzzle? And he said, oh, my God, that's perfect. That's exactly what I did. So that's what a lot of them do. I'm not saying you did it in what you were trying to do, but a lot of entrepreneurs, they can see that vision so clearly, they can taste it. But when they go to describe it, they get into the mundane or they get into the day-by-day operations or whatever it is they're thinking about, and they forget to paint this lovely picture of the beautiful vision they have. And if the investor doesn't see the vision, they're going to think the guy's nuts, or they're certainly not going to put their money into it. Now, later the investor may kick themselves, but at the time of the investment, that's critical.
Yeah, and I noticed that is a challenge to clearly communicate the vision. And that along with investors, but I think it also goes into people understanding what you do, like people that want to maybe get on board on your team or help promote, like they need to see the vision in order to make it healthy and thrive.
Absolutely.
And what do you say?
Absolutely.
And that's kind of my challenge. I just had another guest on the show talking about how important it is to build your dream team. And because some of the listeners don't necessarily have businesses where they want investors, but they're growing and they need that team, or they want that, what Seth Godin called the tribe of people that like believe in what you're doing so much that they're just telling everyone, and it's like free advertising for you. But you have to have that clear vision and be able to communicate that. And that, I mean, and that's a challenge for me as well. When people have gotten the vision, like when they were able to communicate, did you find like what they were able to do?
Yeah, let me divide what you just asked into two different questions, though.
Okay.
So the first one had to do with, you know, this vision thing with Howard that we were talking about, and maybe you. I want to carry the Howard story a step forward, and then I'll bring you to the other about what some people did. So all we just talked about was what I'll call inventing. That's when you're starting the business. It comes to play again when you're reinventing the business, and I believe people have to reinvent their business continually. And in the Howard case, it works just the opposite to what you were just saying about the team or the group that he has to bring on board to work with him. So Howard was very good at attracting team. And before he went public, he brought in people whose skill sets were way beyond his needs because he was, A, believing he was going to become a big company, and B, he wanted to convince Wall Street he was going to be a big company. And by bringing in people with these extraordinary talents, it sent out a message. And they all had been at other companies doing much bigger things. So by the time Howard retired, the guy he had brought on as CFO had become COO. Then he made him CEO, and Howard stepped up to chairman. But then that guy retired, and they brought on another guy on the team, and he moved in as CEO, and the board basically gave him marching orders, which was go out and open as many Starbucks as you can possibly open all over the world. They may have said it a little more businesslike, but that's essentially the message they got through. And he did. He opened thousands and thousands of Starbucks stores, which is great. But when you're opening that many stores and you're trying to manage it properly, you have to come up with certain efficiencies in order to do it properly and cost effectively. Well, his way of doing it was causing a problem that nobody realized. Then 2008 came along, and everybody thought that the recession was causing people not to be able to afford to buy Starbucks. And the two people who believed it most were McDonald's and Dunkin' Donuts, who decided to go on an advertising campaign against Starbucks by saying our cheap coffee costs much less than Starbucks and tastes just as good. And so the newspaper industry, the TV industry, all the media had stories about the recession is killing Starbucks. Well, they pretty much had to change CEOs again. But this time they decided to put Howard back into the seat as CEO. And Howard went out to the stores to look at what was wrong and very quickly figured it out. In order to make the operation more efficient, which cuts costs, etc., they had bought new coffee makers, the machines that actually brew and make the coffee. And these new coffee makers did three things. They cut out the noise, they cut out the aroma, and they were tall in order to accommodate all the equipment in it. So it turns out that the customers kind of liked the sound of coffee being made. It was pretty Pavlovian, I think. They loved the aroma of the coffee. I mean, if you're a coffee drinker, you like the aroma of coffee. So they lost those two sensory reactions. And third, this tall coffee maker blocked the view of the barista from the customer, and they no longer could know your name. It was like they had cut the legs out of the Cheers bar and all the stools fell down. And that became an important part of what was wrong, why people were not coming to Starbucks as much. So he made a big thing of announcing the change. He closed the stores for one day of quote-unquote retraining. I think retraining is part of reinventing, but I also think it was sending a message out to the customers that you ought to try it tomorrow. It's going to be a lot better. And it worked. And it really worked. So right away, it's not just at the point of invention. It's also at every point of reinvention that you have to go through these things. So now in answer to your second question, one of the things that some people do, and not all people can do this, is to create something tangible for people to see. So if you're inventing a widget, that would be that you have to make up a model of something that people can look at. Maybe it has to go further than just a model. It has to be a working prototype so that people can see that the machine actually works. And third, maybe it has to go even further and somebody has to use the working prototype and like it so that you have some kind of proof of concept. In Maxine Clark's case, Maxine started Build-A-Bear. Maxine had been a high officer in a retail giant. She had been the CEO of Payless Shoes, and then she left the corporate world, very smart lady, but left the corporate world where she probably could have moved up even higher than CEO of Payless, and decided to start her own business, Build-A-Bear. She could have, think about the background of this lady, retail. She easily could have gone out and raised the money. She decided instead to put up her own money for the first store. Now, I said not everyone can do that. It costs a lot of money to open up a store, and if you're struggling, you probably don't have the capital to do that yourself, but I'll come back to that in a minute. But she did. She opened the store, and lo and behold, in the first days of the store being opened in the big shopping center, the Galleria Shopping Center in St. Louis, Missouri, a man walked in. He had read an article about this new store, walked into the store, asked for Maxine, and said, "How much do you need to build out more of these?" And they had a little discussion, and he said, "Well, how long can you wait to get the money?" She said, "Well, what did you have in mind?" He said, "Could you wait till next week?" And he invested enough to build the bear. If she had gone to that same man and said, "Let me tell you what I'm thinking of doing. I'm thinking of having a machine that stuffs the stuffing in teddy bears," and so on, there's no way in the world this guy would have done it. Unless he would be one of these miraculous people who can visualize dreams of someone else as well as he can see it tangibly and touch it. Here he was in a store, because stuffing teddy bears by machine is not what she does. Stuffing teddy bears is, a mechanical result, but what she really does is she gives kids a dream about developing their own friend. Their stuffed animal becomes their friend. And there were hundreds and hundreds of makers of teddy bears in this world. She wasn't trying to be another one of those. She was trying to bring entertainment into the store. And so there too, the naysayer friends of hers who said, "Maxine, as long as you're putting up your own money, why don't you start with a real small store and then you won't have as much money at risk. And she said, I can't, because it's not the square footage per dollar of revenue, which is how retail is usually measured. It's an entertainment venue. It's a place where people have enough room to get the feel for all this. And people means kids, of course, but also their parents, their grandparents, or men and women with their significant others when they're buying it for each other. All the different suggestions for that. And incidentally, she has one great line about that when she says, you know, I had been CEO of Payless Shoes, but I've now sold more shoes at Build-A-Bear than I ever did at Payless. They're a little smaller, but she sold more shoes. So she created this test, this proof of concept test that was tangible, so a potential investor or anyone else could see it, experience it, and know immediately what the dream was. So she did give the people the cover with the picture, not just the jigsaw puzzle. There's one other, because I want to contrast it with Maxine, who as an executive had amassed enough money to do this. And this is a guy by the name of James Freeman from San Francisco. James was a professional clarinetist. He loved playing the clarinet. He also loved making coffee for himself and had experimented with some of the kind of futuristic-looking glass tube coffee makers that they used in Japan, of all places. Well, became disillusioned with the clarinet, really wanted to move on with his life, wanted to reinvent himself. And so in the book, Invent, Reinvent, Thrive, I tell the story of this clarinetist who switches over to a coffee store, if you will, which was really just a booth at the farmer's market in San Francisco. And people liked it. The coffee is brewed individually, so you have to stand there for 2-3 minutes while they brew your cup of coffee. People were willing to wait, but, you know, at a farmer's market, you're strolling through the market. The big test would be, would people really like it and do this when they had to spend an extra few minutes on the way to work instead of running through Starbucks and getting it in 2 minutes? He decided to build a tiny, tiny store because he didn't need a big atmosphere. So he built this tiny store in an alleyway, what he called excuse me, but these are his words, a piss-smelly alleyway where bums used to hang out. I mean, it was the worst atmosphere in the world for people to come through the bums and go up through this odor and go to the coffee place and then first smell the coffee. But they did it. And that was proof of concept in a real store. Then, of course, he was able to open other stores, and he now has one in the basement underneath the famous place in New York City with the ice skating.
Oh, Rockefeller Center?
Center. He has a store under Rockefeller Center, thank you, which people are running off the train, and you know how New Yorkers run off the train and race to their office, and they're stopping and taking the extra minutes to stand and wait for a cup of blue bottle coffee, which is what he calls it. So, yes, he had to spend some money, but not very much. But he was able to, by putting that place in the alley, even though it wasn't the ultimate dream store that he had in mind, it was enough of the prototype of it that people could prove the viability of the concept, and people could also understand what he was going to be doing in the next store so he could get financing for that. And it was dramatically different than the way Howard did it. They are very different people. Howard wanted to make a major footprint throughout the world in coffee, and James wanted to make a very small footprint in a few places. But those were the goals of the people, but the methodology for getting the dream across, for articulating it, is very different. One was articulating a dream by talking about it, and the other was articulating a dream by demonstrating it, and those are night and day.
Yeah. I mean, I'm fascinated by people that have been able to bootstrap or start something from nothing and kind of work their way up. I mean, eventually investors have to get on board, but those that have shown by demonstrating are particularly fascinating stories for me, where they can start at a very minimal or low budget and then work their way up. So this book, where can people buy it? How can they kind of connect with you? Is your book for sale on Amazon?
So first of all, connect with me. There's a website, reinventthrive.com, and they can go there. They can also buy the book there if they want, but you can buy the book. When I say buy the book there are links to Amazon, BarnesandNoble.com, Hudson.com, 800 CEO Read. They're all the traditional places you go to buy books. You can also buy them in the stores. There aren't quite as many left as there used to be, but there are enough that you can buy the books at the stores, either Barnes & Noble or one of the local bookstores in your neighborhood. They all can get it.
Awesome. And I'll make sure to put the link to that website in the show notes for anyone that wants to check it out. And thank you so much, Lloyd. Definitely, I learned, I was like absorbing everything you were saying with all of these stories from these successful entrepreneurs. And thank you for taking the time out of your day to talk about your book and your research.
Well, thank you for asking. It was a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you.
Ignore is the root word for the word ignorant, and nobody wants to be ignorant about what they're going to invest part of their life in. So you have to do something more than ignore it.
So there you have it. That was Lloyd Shefsky, author of the book Invent, Reinvent, Thrive. Go on and check out his website at inventreinventthrive.com. And I highly recommend you purchase his book. Anyone that's starting a business, has a business, thinking about starting a business, this is a valuable resource no matter what stage you are, so you can get a better understanding on how to have a very successful, thriving business. Also, as always, if you liked this episode, come on over to my website, movedbypurpose.net. Comment in the comment section. Also, subscribe, rate, and write a review if you like this on iTunes. The more action that's going on, the more activity that's going on will help me get found by more people. And don't be a stranger. If you have any questions or recommend a specific person you'd like to see interviewed on the show, or you have a specific question you would like answered on the show, don't forget you can always contact me on the contact page at movedbypurpose.net. And if you want to stay connected, you can always subscribe and get the latest episodes emailed to you where you are notified right in your inbox. And I'll talk to you all next week.